All right, today's episode, we are speaking about Canada's caregiver programs. No guests today, but luckily I do think, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, Deanna, that you have considerable expertise in the caregiver program going back many years.
That is safe to say, yes.
Yeah. Do you want to actually describe your background a little bit with the caregiver programs?
Sure. My first almost decade in practice, I worked in the not-for-profit sector and I ran it's now the Migrant Worker Center. It was the West Coast Domestic Workers Association at the time. And so I was there and then I went into private practice and I continue to do a lot of work with caregivers, mostly not the solicitor side so much, but doing a lot of litigation for refused applications and doing a lot of consulting with people who are trying to figure out what their options are, employer and caregiver side. I also deal with a lot of cases where caregivers have become ineligible or inadmissible through some set of circumstances and trying to help them get back into status or to obtain permanent residency. But doing a lot of advocacy work along the way in the various iterations of this program, I have generally been consulted by the department about, here's the policy we love to put forward. What is your feedback?
So
And
you've
so,
designed all the programs.
oh yeah, 100% self-styled. Yeah.
Well, so
Uh,
as far as those programs go, I've got a very succinct summary of the different iterations of this program. The longest would have been, and this is all from just an IRCCA tip that I summarized. So 1992 to 2014 is the Live-in Caregiver Program. Um, and it brought in workers to provide in-home care for children, the elderly, the disabled. People would come as temporary workers first. If they got 2 years of work experience, they could apply for permanent residency.
Yes. And so just to add certain nuances is that when you applied for your work permit from abroad, it was like you were entering into this program. And so there was no real concern about whether or not you would overstay because it was kind of acknowledged that by the time you finished your work experience, you had an allotted period of time, you would have a direct pathway to permanent residency. So overstay risk, which is always such a big issue when applying for work permits for like lower semi-skilled persons abroad. That wasn't really an issue.
Yeah.
And so it was really just about, but also the program at that stage allowed people to move between child care work, elder care work, care for persons with disabilities. It was one national occupational classification for all of those roles.
Hmm.
And so you would get a job offer, you come in. There were problems with it for sure. And the other issue was that at that point, it was truly a live-in caregiver program. Living in was a component of a required component of the job. Um,
And is it safe to say that this program was dominated by Filipino women who had to often leave their families in the Philippines while they got their work experience living with other people's families for years on end?
oh yeah, 100%. I think that I don't remember the statistics, it's many years back, but they were more than 50% of the population, probably even more than 60 or 70%. But again, my memory is faded. But a great preponderance of the applicants were just exactly that demographic. And many of them actually came with skills well beyond. So it actually participated in the de-skilling of a lot of people who came with credentials as teachers, as nurses, coming, because they could earn more in Canada as caregivers than they could as nurses working, 12 and 18-hour shifts in the Philippines, to take these jobs. So it definitely filled that gap.
It seemed like a lot, at least anecdotally from what I understand, when they would get their permanent residence, would shift into healthcare roles.
Yeah, and for a lot of people, because the way that the program was set up, you had to do 2 years of work experience, but then you would often be waiting 4, 5, and 6 years to get landed. That by the time that you actually met those requirements, you had lost the ability to re-credential in Canada. So,
Mhm.
I mean, there's no surprise that you walk into any Canadian healthcare facility, all of the lab techs, all of the janitorial staff, like many of them are expats, so to speak, of the Live-in Caregiver Program because they wanted to be back in the healthcare sector. But to go back to working in a nursing occupation would mean really going back to school and starting from fresh.
Yeah.
So many re-credentialed as healthcare aides. And again, that's why they're proliferating in the home care facilities and residential care facilities even still. But going back to nursing was kind of much more challenging because of the delay between when they had entered Canada, because it's again like work experience within the last 4 years, 5 years, and they had been doing their time in Canada as caregivers.
Yeah. And so in 2014, the former Conservative government of Canada under Stephen Harper, and I guess if it was 2014, Minister Alexander, who's former guest or was a previous guest on the podcast, uh, abolished or replaced the Live-in Caregiver Program with two programs, the Caring for Children and the Caring for People with High Medical Needs. These programs have specific education and language requirements and application caps.
Mhm.
What were your thoughts about like those two pilot projects lasted 5 years compared to the previous Live-in Caregiver Program?
So I had grave concerns about the new pilots from the beginning. And make no mistake, this was definitely a Minister Kenny initiative. And I know that because I was participating in the consultations around the creation of the programs under when like it was like a room where Minister Kenny was presiding over those and taking those consultations. So while they came in under Minister Alexander's time slot, they were pretty fully formed by that point. There were a number of issues. Firstly, that caregivers had to come in as regular temporary workers. So that thing about, now you're applying for a work permit from abroad, but there's no direct connection between what you're going to apply for from overseas and the eventual permanent residency. So we saw a huge uptick of refusals on the basis of overstay risk. That was the first issue. But also the caregiver pilots extremely poorly defined what was going to be required in order to qualify for permanent residency. And none of those requirements were imported into the work permit side of things. So you could come in with no work experience, because that's what the knock says, that you don't need these things. You could come in without the experience, without the language skills at the same level required for permanent residency, without the university level education, get in, do your work, and then go to apply for permanent residency. And the program was capped for the year, or you couldn't meet the language test requirements or didn't have the right amount of education. But because they were delinked,
Yeah.
that like they weren't doing the proper assessment from the outset. And so you get here, do all of the thing, and then
And
find
then
out
not
that
qualify for permanent residence.
exactly. So that was a totally foreseeable outcome, and one that pretty much every advocate and representative was like, this is going to create a problem. Everybody, this is going to be an issue. And lo and behold, it was a huge issue. The number of JRs I had to run during that period for overstay risk, and then the number of issues faced by people who came here, made their commitment. And I don't think that that was accidental. I think, Minister Kenny was very much a proponent of temporary is temporary and permanent is permanent. The
Yeah.
fact that you come in and do your work doesn't mean that we're going to grant you landing. So there should be a decoupling of those two assessments, but
The
it
other
led
shift here
to
is they get rid of the live-in requirement, right?
yes, they do
Yeah.
in theory. However, it doesn't mean you're not allowed to live
Mhm.
in. And so it left open the potential for an employer to say, you'll live in. And again, if that was a more cost-effective thing for the employee, it didn't remove the dependency, if you know what I'm saying. So if an
Yeah.
employer says, I'd like for you to live in, and the caregiver's like, well, I'd like to get a job, you would still very frequently find, and I still would think that I think, and again, I don't know the statistics on this, but I would still, my anecdotal experience was that the majority were still living in at that point.
And we then go in 2019 um, to the Liberal government introduces the home child care provider and home support worker pilots, which are ongoing, although they're about to be replaced. These programs, we kind of go from okay or bad to worse to I don't know how you'll describe this, and I'll ask you in a second, but the current programs try to fix this issue that I guess you were talking about, how people would come as caregivers with no guaranteed pathway to permanent residence by tying the two together. And people could, it's a bit complicated in that they need 2 years of Canadian experience, but they can start their permanent residence and say that they're going to get it soon because they have a job offer. Or if they already have the 2 years experience, they can apply for permanent residence. It has open work permits within it, and there's still education and language requirements.
Yeah.
This program, I'm not sure, I don't think anyone would call it a resounding success. It's hard to know if to what extent that's because of the COVID-19 pandemic, but maybe you can add your thoughts on
Hmm.
these two pilots.
Yeah, I mean, COVID definitely contributed to taking it from bad to worse. But I think that there were fundamental design flaws from day one, that again, I believe that many, myself included, were shrieking, like, this is not a fix. This is actually like foreseeable issues right here and there. So in terms of the new pilots, again, they can, and this was like the same with the previous pilots. A caregiver for children is totally distinct from a caregiver for elders. So there's no mobility between those two occupations, which to me was like, anyways, it is what it is. But that was a determination that they made. They had then the home childcare pilots, both of these iterations, the old pilots and the current or the new pilots that are now expired. Both of them were oversubscribed in the childcare side and undersubscribed in the elder care side. And I don't
Yeah.
think that that's because there's a lack of demand in the elder care side, but just because the program was fundamentally incompatible with meeting the needs of employers looking for care in the elder care sector because they're so slow. You just can't use a program to help provide care for an elder person where it's going to take 3 years to process
Yeah. Three
because
years for the work permit.
three
I
years
think
for
we
the
should
work
also
permit.
add that as part of this program introduction, they got rid of the ability to apply for caregiver work permits for the most part, unless someone was applying through this program.
Yeah, it's not just that, but like, okay, first of all, the programs that sunsetted in 2016, they actually ended that program early. And so all of a sudden there was like this vacuum where they just cut
Mm.
it off while people were like just planning, I'm almost there, I'll be there before June. They just ended it suddenly one day. And they had to create they created this thing called the Interim Pathway for caregivers to like, okay, we're going to try and let a bunch of people in without these language requirements that we kind of thrust on people, and maybe they didn't make any sense, and they lowered the requirements and they lowered the work experience, but that was like a window of opportunity and then it was gone. And in the meantime, there was the temporary to permanence program that had caregiver pathways. So then they brought in these new ones, and these new ones, the most fun. First of all, you've explained the first issue, which is that nobody
These new ones
understood them.
predate the TRPR because I had people who applied for caregiver program in 2019 under the new programs, heard nothing, then did
Yes.
the TRPR in 2021 and got approved before we got an acknowledgement of receipt on the caregiver program that was filed 2 years earlier.
You're right. They did predate, but it was kind of like for a while, there was like three options: the interim
Mhm.
caregiver, the new pilot, and the TR to PR. And people were like, what are these three? Which one makes sense for me? And so it was a shit show, put it that way, because people were
Yeah.
like, which one makes sense? And you would be like, this one makes sense for you based on your circumstances. And then all of a sudden the processing time would double. And then it turns out they had made the wrong choice. And so that was quite a fiasco at that point. But where the new program stands is the HCCP, the home child care provider, and the home support worker pilot, is what the biggest fundamental change was that you cannot apply from abroad for a work permit anymore at all. And so this is what you were insinuating, but I don't think that the implications of that were fully realized, because people were like, but surely people can come. So you would apply for permanent residency with or without having the work experience. And then you have to get approval in principle before you can get a work permit that comes from that. If you're in Canada or you already have a work or study permit, then you can apply for an LMIA based work permit. But in
Mhm.
any other circumstances, you can't. And so, again, there was this weird period because remember how there was a COVID related provision where visitors could apply for work permits from within Canada. So for a period of time, and it was almost a year, I believe, people were coming in as visitors and making in Canada LMIA based applications. And then that worked until they shut that avenue as well. So now it's just simply if you don't have another kind of a work or study permit, you must apply for permanent residency and you must
Mhm.
wait what is often 2 years or longer for interim approval of that application in order to be able to get the initial work permit. Now, the really bizarre part about this is
But
that
they
with
never
this
processed
program,
anything.
that's bizarre too, but that in order to apply for permanent residency, you needed a job offer. However, when you got your interim approval and you got the work permit, it was an open permit. So you were still tied to getting that job offer, and they were still going to do an assessment as to the genuineness of that job offer, but you're in no way tied to that employer, which has led to a bunch of processing absurdities because now you'll see cases, and this is what I'm in the dregs of litigating right now. They'll wait 2 years, then they'll contact the employer. The employer will refuse to provide financial documents or whatever the interaction might be. And then suddenly they'll say, well, we don't believe that you have a genuine application. And so, but again, it seems very kind of confusing because in no way, like if they were to come into Canada and the employer said, there's no lack of jobs that are available for them here in Canada. In fact, there are like many, many people who are like, okay, well, if somebody's here with an open permit, I would happily hire them. But that avenue is still cut off. And so this thing of needing a job offer but not being in any way tied to that employer is very bizarre. And so I have a number of cases that I'm still litigating, as I mentioned, where they would like write to a caregiver after 2 years and say, send me your employer's 2 years of financial documents. And when the caregiver said, my employer has said they won't provide it to me, they then refuse the application as being non-genuine. And again, there are so many fairness issues arising from that, but I've got two of those cases in the gears right now. So this is still where we're at.
Yeah, I mean, for me, the big issue with the two programs was just the processing times. Like I would tell families that we have a caregiver program where if your kids are in kindergarten, given the processing times, by the time the application for the work permit would be approved, your 8-year-old would be 11.
Yeah,
And for, this is going to sound harsh, but for elderly people, it almost looked like they were just waiting. It was possible that people would die
yeah,
before their care would arrive.
for sure. And I mean, it's just it was so frequently the case that it led to a lot of absurdities in the processing of these applications.
Yeah, two questions on impacts. First, I don't have the stats in front of me. I know that under the Live-in Caregiver Program, it was something like it was like 89, 90% Filipino. That has decreased dramatically over the years. So my first question would be, do you know what has caused that shift in the country of origin composition of the program? And second, have the new programs done anything to reduce abuse within the program of caregivers?
So the first one, I think that really as avenues for permanent residency in so many other areas have become so challenging, I think that the popularity of the caregiver program has really grown. I think also, like I see a lot of caregiver applications now coming from China, from South America, from Central America. So I think that there is a greater diversity. I think that there was a bit of a stranglehold on the caregiver program previously because that program was kind of part of the Philippines foreign export policy. And it was very much like the number of training programs that were being offered under the Live-in Caregiver Program by foreign companies in the Philippines who were promoting, charging for the finding of the employer, all of that sort of thing. That really did create an overrepresentation of Filipinos in that workforce.
Yeah.
And I think that that's just kind of it's spread out. The issue with it now is that those programs, all of the pilot programs, because they're created by ministerial instruction, they're subject to strict quotas. And so it's the actual regulations that state that a program that's created by ministerial instruction can never exceed 2,750. And so there are a couple of issues with this. One of them is that they have blended within one class both those who are already in Canada seeking to regularize their status and those applying from outside of Canada trying to get in. So that means that, like, with these old programs, on the 1st of January, they would open and within hours they would be gone. And those most eager might have been those coming from outside trying to get in, taking places from those who are already here, who are
Mm,
trying to now get permanent residency. And so the fact that they had people competing against newcomers, like people who were already here, integrated, finished their work experience. So they try to like segment it in different ways, but it's like, how many ways can you skin a cat? Like there was only 2,750 per year, and any way that you cut it, they were gone within a day.
yeah.
And then you'd have to be set for another year again.
And now we have an announcement of a new program within, and as far first just numbers, like the plan from 2024 to 2026 is for 15,000 caregivers to be admitted as permanent residents.
Yeah, I'd be a
Um,
little bit suspicious about that though, because they're also, I'm sure, counting their inventory of unprocessed
yeah,
applications. So that will last them for many years to come, I believe, because it's not just people that were admitted into this program, but all of those who were here as workers that came in under other iterations of the program or who came as postgraduate, they got postgraduate work permits
yeah,
or got whatever, that now are just trying to regularize their status. And so I think, again, it sort of looks like it's new because it's projected on a future landings, but
yeah.
again, it's just about catching up with old numbers.
The other stat they have in before I get to the description of the program, is that in June 2014, there were 60,000 applications in the inventory. And they say that now that less than 1% of that inventory remains, which is pretty wild that in 2024, there's still up to 600 applications that have been in process for 10 years since 2014. Who knows when they applied? Anyway, the new program is very different, in my opinion. And the requirements, there are four. First, the applicant must have a minimum language score of 4 in the Canadian language benchmarks.
As
Second, they
opposed
have
to
to have,
five,
as
which was
opposed to
what it was
5.
before 5. Yeah.
Yeah. So slightly lower language, hold the equivalent of a Canadian high school diploma, so lower education requirement,
Hmm.
have recent and relevant work experience, which doesn't have to be in Canada, and receive an offer of full-time job in Canada, a home care job in Canada.
Hmm.
And that's it. So completely getting rid of the Canadian work experience requirement is sort of the big thing that leaps out. Thoughts?
Okay, so a few, first of all. One of them is that you need a Canadian high school education, um,
Or equivalent.
or equivalent.
Yeah.
Um, I do like I don't know if you've ever managed to get an equivalency assessment done on a high school diploma. Um, but I mean, I think even trying to get a Canadian high school to issue documents, like much less going to, a high school in the Philippines and saying, here's the material. Like it's very difficult to get an ECA issued. I've tried it only once, and it was just very difficult to find the documents necessary to obtain an
Yeah.
ECA saying that this is equivalent. So that's a significant issue. Um, I want to go back for 1 second and just say that when they announced that this program was already designed to expire in June, but at the very last minute, they actually changed the requirements within the pilots to say, and they had done this along the way. They had brought 2 years down to 1 year, and now at the very, very end, they said, actually, now we'll accept experience from abroad. And
Yeah.
so it's like, whoa, whoa, what just happened for all those people that have been waiting all of those years for their applications in
I think as
process?
they were processing less and less, and they weren't anywhere near to hitting their numbers because they had never issued work permits in order to hit their levels, they had to just keep lowering the requirements. Although at the
Yeah,
same time, they passed ministerial instructions banning people who provided elder care in institutions like corporate
for
institutions,
sure.
old folks' homes, places, long-term care facilities from applying, which they're now bringing back the ability to do.
Yes, exactly. Again, it was a very strange thing to watch the target change. It's like people who were not able to complete the work experience requirements, which prevented them from regularizing their status. And then all of a sudden the work experience requirement goes down, then basically disappears. And
Yeah. I mean, it
it's
kind
like
of like,
this,
is the goal to is the goal of a caregiver program or any program to admit a certain number of people under requirements or to hit quotas for
yeah, I don't
application
know.
categories? I mean, I would think it would be the former, but this read like that they were just trying to hit targets
They were just trying
by
to hit
lowering
targets.
lowering their existing program requirements.
Yeah,
Although now the new program, well, is just completely different in that there
it's
is
just
no,
completely different. And it's also like when you look at the actual administration of those applications, you're still seeing them challenging applications on the basis like, oh, you didn't provide your employer's notice of assessment, and therefore I find the job offer non-genuine. Like it's just like it feels like just this wild beast. I have no understanding of what they're actually trying to accomplish by these changes. And it's like the left hand is not talking to the right. You know, we're not meeting
yeah,
our quotas, and yet we're criticizing um, that this job offer doesn't seem to be genuine when you've delayed 3 years and now are coming back and giving them 10 days to produce confidential documents that are not in any way in their care and control.
yeah.
And no procedural fairness being offered when you say, can I have another 30 days to replace the job offer? No, refused. You know, it's like what's happening. So it's very disorienting to work in this space because I have no idea what the actual objective is.
Well,
Um,
that's the thing, and this so Mikal and I talked about this program a little bit in our episode about the economics of Canadian immigration. And we were both, I don't know if the word critical is right, but kind of questioning like what is the goal of this program? Because as we mentioned before, once people get permanent residence, a lot move into the healthcare space because that's where their education traditionally at least has been in and
mhm.
their work experience has been in. And so given the shortages in healthcare, such that there's category specific draws, is this going to be a program where people do come and work as caregivers when they get PR? Or is it going to be they arrive, they have PR, they either never start in those jobs, even if they were genuine to begin with, they
Mm-hmm.
just get here and think, I can make more in the unbelievably short-staffed healthcare system.
Yes.
And if that's the goal, should there just be a healthcare program
Yeah,
instead of a
exactly.
caregiver program?
That's exactly what I'm saying. And this idea
Oh,
of,
that's interesting. I was because you weren't on the episode with Mika. As we were talking, I was like, I wonder what Deanna's thoughts on this are going to be,
yeah,
as
I mean,
with
there's a
much experience with the
reason
program.
for sure. There's a reason why people had the work experience requirements because that's what employers want, because they actually want the captive you know, the idea that somebody is compelled, that dependency on the work experience is what and I mean part of that, and I think Minister Kenny was quite right, that part of the reason for that is because it's hard work and it's underpaid. And so I think one thing that Minister Kenny did that actually improved the quality of the work, this is the one thing that I think has been done to improve the quality of the work, is he took prevailing wage for caregivers away from minimum wage, which is what it had been at the time that he started critiquing this program. And he's like, it can't be minimum wage. You know, that's not a living wage for an adult woman who's also supporting family abroad. Like it's just not. And so I think, but again, in terms of the like, you know, preventing abuse, that has really been untouched. To go back to a question you asked earlier, it's still this approach where somebody who, you know, works without authorization, who leaves a job, who doesn't meet the requirements, they are still getting the brunt of enforcement. You know, unless they can satisfy an officer that they're the victim of human trafficking, meeting those standards, or a vulnerable worker through the vulnerable worker application. And there's still people going to those options in droves, but nothing that actually addresses the abuse that's created in the program by this dependency. But again, what you're saying about like, okay, so if I were a nurse and I could apply through a skilled work pathway, or I could just come in as a caregiver. I have all the same qualifications. I just need a job offer. I come in, I'm a permanent resident, and now I have the option to choose where to go. And again, I don't think that that's a bad outcome for Canada. You know, there
Yeah,
is a
yeah.
massive shortage, but is this actually a caregiver program at all?
Well, and that's the thing is the requirements are so low. There already were genuineness concerns. Like my experience with the caregiver program has largely been judicial review of decisions involving concerns around genuineness, where family members were the ones who were going to be the employer, which I think
Yeah,
always just created this tension of like, well, it's anytime family is involved with hiring. Is it arm's
yeah.
length? Is it real? And
Are they going to get
it just
paid?
seems like a weird, are they going to get paid?
Yeah.
And it just, it will depend also again on what the processing times are, but I do have these questions of like, what is the point? Like, what is it, I don't believe that they expect, well, I'm curious to know what percent they expect will actually stay in the job once they get here.
I mean, I don't think that it should be the mandate to ensure that somebody stays in an underemployed situation. I don't. But at the same time, you know, especially because there are those needs, but I feel like creating a very prescribed, small, like what's this called, niche program that is you know, that I think is just like it's going to be like everyone is right now looking for a back door.
Yeah, like,
And because there are so that the front doors are firmly closed.
yeah, and we've
Uh
talked about this before, is like, it's brutal for people in STEM and pretty much any position in Canada. I mean, that's overbroad, but in a lot of positions in Canada who are actively working here to stay because of points requirements, this doesn't have a point requirement, is open to pretty much anyone in Canada or abroad who has a job offer as a caregiver. And I just don't know what, like, I'm not fully, I think, I don't know what I mean, it feels like a caregiver program in almost name only. And I'd be very curious once the stats are out, how many actually worked in their caregiving positions.
mhm,
And again, like I don't believe people should be tied to jobs where their skills are underutilized, but I also don't know why. It feels like they 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 don't want, it feels like the department doesn't want to get rid of the caregiver program because maybe
mhm,
of the optics of that. But I'm not convinced that given how hard it is to become a permanent resident, and especially given the shortages in healthcare, where just whether this is the best use of limited economic immigration
mhm.
spots.
Well, I mean, I would say, you know, having spent so much of my career working in this sector, I don't have any doubt in my mind that the people who come in through the caregiver programs are some of my favorite future Canadians. You
Yeah, yeah.
know, I think it's a really and so the idea for me of creating fewer barriers for that community to become part of our community, I think is wonderful. So I'm fully in support of that. And I mean, I've been advocating for my entire career that it should be permanent residence on arrival, because I think of the vulnerabilities. And I think that's where we are right now. So I think that the conundrum that I face is really more about bad actors utilizing it for the wrong reasons, that and so I guess this is part of what they've been playing with in the past is that, like, let's say, I mean, I had one application not a couple of years ago where somebody who was a medical doctor in China who was applying to come to Canada as a caregiver. And truly, she would have earned more as a caregiver in Canada than she was as a medical doctor in China, and also probably in a good role, working better hours. So this was like, and she wrote this like, letter of intent explaining all these things. Um, and so surely her experience as a medical doctor should qualify her for this work as a caregiver, because the NOC has no work experience requirements specific to being a caregiver. So we were successful. And so in those sorts of circumstances, like, she should definitely, her medical experience working in a pediatric ward should clearly qualify her to work as a
I
caregiver
mean,
in
she should
Canada,
also be
right?
allowed to work as a pediatric ward here.
Yeah. And so it's again like I'm not even entirely sure what I'm suggesting, but the idea is that I now feel that those 2,750 cases will be snapped up in 1 second. And I
Oh
think
God, yeah.
it's not going to be necessarily the same cohort that was entering under the caregiver program. And so I don't know exactly what can be done to actually monitor that. But again, the idea that it's now a job offer that is still being attached, even though the job offer is completely meaningless. I don't understand what it means to ask a permanent resident to come in with a job offer that they're going to be in no way tied to. Again, they could make a misrepresentation allegation in the end of the day if they don't end up working for
Yeah.
that person. But it just seems to me like, again, if it's based on past work history, maybe that is trying to rationalize, but again, are they just not going to accept work as a nurse as being equivalent experience the way that they always have in the past? And I mean, what I've been doing for years is saying, like, if you've raised your own children, doesn't that qualify you to be a caregiver? So can you then say that my previous work experience? And so anyways, I'm confused by this, and we have so little information about what is actually going to happen, how long it's going to take to process, what the quotas are going to look like, how they're going to evaluate your actual qualifications, how they're going to preclude people that they think are just looking for a backdoor.
Yeah.
And so I love the openness of it for this particular cohort. But again, I'm worried about the bad actors.
So I think just looking at the time, I have a case summary, final thought, and then a question for you.
Mhm.
Just because you brought up being a stay-at-home parent, below on my blog of the summary of the different programs, there's actually one case that directly addresses this point. It's Sibal,
It's
Sibal
a
v.
great decision.
Canada. Oh, you know about it. Good. Is it one
Yeah,
of
for
your
sure.
cases or?
No, no, but I've
Uh,
used it a lot.
so I don't have the neutral citation, but it's Madam Justice Elliott where she says, quote, I cannot imagine an experience more relevant to being a nanny raising someone's children than being a stay-at-home mother raising her own two children. And the paragraph goes on with stuff specific about the case. But that is a case where at least Madam Justice Elliott, does say that being a mother should be, or parent being should be qualifying experience. My own thoughts are that, okay, they'll have this program. I do hope that they monitor where people go within the 1 to 5 years after they become a permanent resident. And if it is found that, like, they are going into healthcare or some other space for the most part, possibly just create the pathways to where the job demand clearly is. And
Mhm.
then my question for you, maybe to wrap it up, would be with the existence of this program, do you think there should or shouldn't be LMIAs and work permits for caregivers?
Um, yeah, I mean, I think that they're like, from what I hear anyways, I don't have little kids anymore, but there's a significant labor market demand. And
Yes.
so
As someone with kids around that age, yes.
yeah. At the same time, I find the fact that there would be an absence of any avenue toward permanent residency. So I think that yes, there should be a way for people to get an LMIA-based work permit. I also think that there should be a pathway for people that have Canadian work experience as a caregiver to regularize their status. To me, the to say, yes, you can get an LMIA-based work permit, but then when you're done, we are not making you any offer to be able to regularize your status. I do not, that to me is going backwards in time because you
Mhm,
started with the Live-in Caregiver Program. The Live-in Caregiver Program was not the first iteration. There was before that, the Foreign Domestic Worker Program,
mhm,
which was you can come in, you can work, and then you can go back. And that was what caused the rallying cry of good enough to work, good enough to stay. And that's what caused the Live-in Caregiver Program to come in the first place. Because once you've created that work, once you've allowed Canadian families to make, to get by, to allow them to raise their children while still participating in the Canadian labor market, that to me is a way of earning permanent residency as well. So creating this new direct permanent resident pathway doesn't obviate the need to allow people to fill urgent labor market needs in a time effective manner and then to gain permanent residence through that work the way that somebody does in
yeah,
the Canadian experience class.
yep. And I don't know if you saw in the forward regulatory plan, there is some sort of a plan to announce in the fall a program to provide a pathway to permanent residency for tier 4 or 5 low skilled positions. I
Hmm.
don't know if it'll be more fruitful than the apparently aborted plan to provide status to everyone who's without status.
Hmm.
Um, and it'll also come at a time when they're also announcing apparently soon new measures to reduce the number of temporary residents. So lots to talk about in future
Yes,
episodes.
definitely. Definitely. It's a very interesting one.
Awesome. Well,
Okay.
take care.
Yeah, you too, Steve.